Namaste.
Namaste.
Hello, and welcome to Regional Growth and Resilience, the podcast where we explore how neighboring economies can collaborate for sustainable development and shared prosperity. I'm your host, Deepika Upadhyay. Today's episode poses a critical question. Can Sri Lanka turn to a fast growing regional capital markets, such as those in India, Malaysia, or Thailand, as viable alternatives to traditional sovereign borrowing from India, China, or the IMF? To help us unpack this, we are joined by a distinguished guest, Dr. Naresh Bana, a globally renowned advisor on public private partnerships and project financing. His expertise has guided governments and institutions around the world in building resilient project financing strategies. Dr. Bana, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Deepika ji.
Sir, let's begin with the big picture. What's the current status of Sri Lanka's debt restructuring, and how does this shape the urgency for seeking alternative funding sources?
Deepika ji, the status of restructuring of Sri Lanka is basically it was taken up with support from IMF last year, and it was carefully planned, and the attributes which are strengths of Sri Lanka, like their domestic savings which are quite high, the remittances of overseas Sri Lankans, and also the growing tourism revenue was duly factored in. At the same time, the creditors like India, Japan, and France, along with others, they created a coordination committee which was chaired by France, and China supported it from outside. This committee was provided full support, almost real time support by the IMF staff in helping them taking the decisions. So that resulted in a lot of good decisions like macro based bonds being issued. They also noticed that the domestic debt, which is quite substantial, need to be addressed in a different way, and they brought in lower interest rates and extended the payment timelines. Overall, with support of the IMF, the country secured roughly 3 billion debt forgiveness, which is substantial, and 25 billion of uh, timelines extension and lowering of interest rates. So, additionally, Sri Lanka introduced, as I mentioned, innovative debt instruments to replace the existing sovereign bonds. These were GDP linked bonds, which are also called macro linked bonds, and governance linked bonds in its restructuring agreements. These macro linked bonds, for which the payout is linked to the GDP performance of Sri Lanka, are attractive to investors. These bonds are being issued in exchange for existing bonds and are considered a pioneering approach in sovereign finances. Given the scale of magnitude of the debt and the need to restore market confidence swiftly, Sri Lanka continues to face acute urgency not only to manage current obligations but to secure long term, more stable financing. That's why we need to explore possibility of raising funds in regional debt markets, and that is also for it's possible that they may get lower borrowing costs and better alignment with local growth dynamics, and it may be more sustainable alternative than high cost bilateral loans or rigid IMF conditionalities.
That sets the stage well. But if we step outside Sri Lanka for a moment, let's look at the region. How developed are bond markets in India, Malaysia, and Thailand? And more importantly, could Sri Lanka realistically assess them in the near term?
Deepika ji, regional bond markets in Asia have matured notably in recent decades. For instance, international bond issuance from Asia has soared in last 2 decades, although in 22 there was some contraction reported. Yet, India and several ASEAN countries remain robust issuers of sovereign bonds. And as per International Capital Markets Association, India accounted for a sizable share of sustainable green bonds, almost 40% of its total issuance in 2022. ASEAN countries like Malaysia and Thailand have developed local currency bonds that are deep and liquid with infrastructure. And by infrastructure, I mean the technology, the system, the institutions, the governing rules, and dispute redressal mechanisms which help run the bond markets effectively and efficiently. And governments and corporates both can issue bonds and uh, take care of the funding requirements. Initiatives such as Asian Bond Market Initiative aims to integrate and sustain and standardize local currency bond infrastructure across Asia. While Sri Lanka's own bond market is fairly large as compared to its economy, it is capital markets infrastructure leaves much to be desired. Therefore, however, there is a shining example of DFCC Bank of Sri Lanka having issued green bonds last year at India's GIFT IFSC, and that promises cross-border accessibility. And just to recap, GIFT IFSC is Gujarat International Financial Tech City, and IFSC stands for International Financial Services Center. This is a special economic zone in Gujarat and is designed to promote international financial services, banking, and capital markets within India. The DFCC Bank of Sri Lanka also became the first foreign corporate issuer to list its green bonds on the NSE International Exchange at Gift City on June 10 this year. That's a great news. The bond size was Lankan rupees 2.5 billion, which is equivalent to US dollars 8 million, and it will be used for funding solar energy projects in Sri Lanka, supporting the country's renewable energy goals. This strategic listing, it is a strategic listing, and it's the first of its kind at Gift City, aims to promote regional sustainable finance and integrate the region's capital markets. So the proof of concept is there and more can be done. But to undertake large fundraising, Sri Lanka would need to meet market readiness requirements, credit rating norms, and possible issue of bonds in regional currency formats.
Interesting. So these markets are opening up. The next question is, why choose them? What advantages do regional markets actually offer when compared to more traditional sources like China or the IMF?
Deepika ji, very good. This is, you see, it allows first and foremost diversification of funding sources. You are not only dependent on one source, and one source like China or IMF or any other country. Your geopolitical and conditional risk are spread. Regional markets can also diversify creditor base and reduce exposure to any one jurisdiction's terms or agendas. Secondly, it may have potentially lower borrowing costs, as I mentioned earlier, as regional economies and investors may accept lower risk premiums if they perceive stronger regional growth. And there are synergies where the people could be invested, the corporates could be invested in the neighboring economy, and they are confident about development of Sri Lanka. Thirdly, it may align with local development priorities of neighboring countries or the regional economies, and instruments such as green or sustainable bonds, which I just spoke about, can attract regionally aligned investors seeking impact financing. And fourthly, it reduces stigma and conditionality, which comes along with the programs like IMF. So, as you know, the IMF programs come with tight fiscal conditionalities, tapping capital markets, especially with performance linked bonds, can align repayment with Sri Lanka's economic recovery trajectory, offering more flexible, incentive compatible structure. Furthermore, issuance of regional currency bonds alleviates foreign exchange risk and taps domestic investor pools eager to invest regionally.
Of course, every opportunity comes with challenges. Let me flip the coin, sir. What are the key obstacles Sri Lanka must address before it can tap regional markets successfully?
Of course, there are a couple of formidable challenges, and let me list them out. Firstly, Sri Lanka's domestic bond market, though relatively large relative to her GDP, lacks depth, liquidity, and institutional investors' participation is less compared to India or Malaysia. They need to invest in modern infrastructure for capital markets in general and bond markets in particular. With that, I mean improve the technology, the systems, the institutions, the rules governing those markets, and dispute redressal mechanisms have to be put in place that enable the capital markets to function efficiently and effectively, enabling both governments and corporates to hold trade and ensure there is a timely and quick dispute redressal mechanism existing. Secondly, there is a need to improve credit worthiness and ratings of the country. We know that despite restructuring gains, credit ratings and investor trust remains fragile for Sri Lanka. I have myself experienced and spoken to many investors who, while they appreciate the business propositions of any business in Sri Lanka, especially the large infrastructure projects, they are not able to move the investments and express reservations for various reasons. And one of them is the credit rating. So there is a then there is a need to show there is a policy consistency and governance stability in the environment. Those need to be not only practiced but publicized as well with examples. Thirdly, there is need to appreciate that issuing in regional currencies poses foreign exchange risk, while issuing in local currency has limited subscriber base. Additionally, regulatory standards for regional exchanges could be far more stringent, and they must be ready to come up to those standards. And lastly, the political and policy continuity are essential to ensure that future governments may not reconsider restructuring terms or new bond frameworks. And it is to be underlined that ensuring continuity of policy is essential to reassure markets and investors.
That makes sense, sir. And it's always helpful to learn from others' journey. Are there models or precedents? Countries that have managed to issue bonds in neighboring regional markets that Sri Lanka can draw inspiration from.
Yes, there are examples, but the best example we see is the DFCC Bank's green bond issuance via GIFT IFSC in India. It is a first for a Sri Lankan issuer entering Indian debt market. It shows regional investors' appetite for sustainably aligned issues. And then there are many examples from ASEAN countries who regularly issue sovereign bonds in regional and international markets. Their success actually stems from institutional investor bases, developed local currency bond markets, and listing in international centers like Hong Kong and Singapore. They also have the Asian Bond Market Initiative, which fosters cross border issuance and standardization frameworks with participation from multiple ASEAN countries. And thirdly, the macro linked instruments themselves are very innovative and pioneering effort where we have already discussed about Sri Lanka, and they have already issued it. And as seen, uh, we find it quite innovative in their thinking and future planning, and it can set a standard for not only themselves but for the emerging market economies to embed performance contingencies. So these are some of the pointers to suggest the potential viability of regional market access. But this also underscores that Sri Lanka must build institutional readiness to replicate such models which are successful and for others to emulate as well.
Yes, of course. Sir, if Sri Lanka were to go down this route, how might it structure debt instruments in ways that really align with regional investors' interest?
Deepika ji, there could be, I mean, a lot of innovations, but let me just list a few here. And they can uh, follow what they have just done, that is, issuance of green, social, or sustainably linked bonds, which was issued by DFCC Bank in Gift City, IFSC, India. And they can raise more funds based on that format, or they can link it to macro performance like GDP growth, or the governance linked bond which they have already issued, and they can also issue in local currency as well, though it has its own limitations. And but importantly, Sri Lanka would need to ensure clarity, transparency, and verifiable matrices for such instruments and structure them to be simple enough for index inclusion and investor confidence.
Dr. Bana, policy credibility often makes or breaks investor confidence. So, what kind of policy and institutional reforms would Sri Lanka need to prioritize in order to gain trust in these regional markets?
Deepika ji, I did mention that in brief earlier, but let me list these again. First and foremost, Sri Lanka needs to strengthen its credit rating and credit profile. And that can be done via sustained fiscal discipline, inflation control, and transparent macroeconomic management, reinforcing restructuring gains and IMF program credibility. Then, as I mentioned, they need to upgrade their capital market infrastructure. That includes clearing systems, custody, settlement, and institutional investors' participation. And these reforms could be supported by ADB or World Bank, and that can be done. Then they need to modernize legal and disclosure regime to ensure the bond covenants, documentation, and regulatory compliances meet international or cross-border standards. Then we have requirement to build investor uh, interest and capabilities by offering transparent communication and credible markets, especially for novel instruments like macro linked or ESG bonds. They also need to foster regional partnerships aggressively, perhaps under system like Asian Bond Market Initiative or bilateral MOUs to facilitate listing, cross-border recognition, and investor access. And then they also have to ensure policy continuity, which has got no substitute. And Regardless of political party in power, they need to maintain investor trust by ensuring policies do not change unless there is a gross deviation or there is some drastic change which requires intervention.
So, stepping back and weighing everything we've discussed, advantages, challenges, and reforms, does a strong case really exist from Sri Lanka to turn regionally for sovereign debt solutions instead of relying exclusively on China or IMF financing?
Yes, of course, a compelling case exists and proof of concept is already in place. As I mentioned, the DFCC Bank fundraising case. Sri Lanka's recent restructuring, secured with the help of IMF engagement, significant debt relief, and pioneering macro linked instruments, provides critical short term stability, but long term resilience will rest on diversifying financing options. The regional debt markets come in there, and Asian regional markets offer a lot of advantages, that is, diversification of funding sources and potentially lower borrowing costs and regional development goal alignment or possibly innovative financial instruments as we have discussed. And it can help Sri Lanka return to its growth trajectory. However, Sri Lanka must steadily build its credibility, upgrade market infrastructure, and design investor friendly instruments that are transparent and simple to trade. If successful, Sri Lanka could not only improve its own financing sustainability but also become a role model for regional financing integration. And that would demonstrate how middle income post restructuring economies can tap supportive, growth aligned regional capital markets and make a good future for themselves.
Dr. Bana, thank you for your insights. You've painted a clear picture of both the opportunities and the roadblocks Sri Lanka faces as it looks to diversify its financial options. And that brings us to the end of today's episode. Sri Lanka stands at a crossroads, emerging from crisis, innovating in sovereign finance, and eyeing regional markets for her next chapter of development. Whether it steps confidently into these markets will depend on the reform, credibility, and investors' trust. I'm Deepika Upadhyay, and you've been listening to Regional Growth and Resilience. Stay tuned for more conversations on how regional economies can grow stronger together. Until next time, take care and keep building resilience. Namaste.
Namaste.